Hello, hello, and welcome, my dear friends, to Myo Missing Link. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that I feel like is so exceptionally important, and nobody talks about it at all in most myofunctional therapy courses, and certainly not the introductory ones, because for whatever reason, people happen to think that introductory courses with like intermediate/advanced prices are supposed to not contain this information. I don't know, really weird, goes over my head. But here I am to share with you something that I don't think enough people are talking about. So I am going to welcome you in because that's what I normally do. Today it was a very tight schedule for me today. I just barely made it here on time. Just going to have a sip of water. Throw me a hello in the chat. So happy to be here. Let's dive in. This one won't be too long. I won't keep you super long. We're probably going to talk for about a half hour about this lovely, amazing bone here. This is the keystone bone. And in another lecture that I have, I actually compared it to the Avengers and that last whole movie franchise thing that they had where they were looking for all the stones and all the stones went in the glove and whatever. This bone, the sphenoid bone, is the keystone for the cranium. Okay. And so with the cranium, we have all these cranial bones that come together, and all of them actually attach to this wonderful little beautiful butterfly here that we have as the sphenoid bone. Now, it's not just the cranial bones that are attaching. We also have a lot of fascia and muscle and soft tissue connections that happen in between there. And that's the home for our lovely pituitary gland, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But the sphenoid bone is actually, as the keystone, it's going to be really important in determining our patient's posture and their appearance, because you'll find a lot of times with myofunctional therapy, we're looking at it all the time, asymmetries, right? And to a certain extent, asymmetry happens. Asymmetry is just a fact and a way of life. We have a dominant lung for people who don't know about that. We have some dominance within our diaphragm. We have dominance within, our positioning. So sometimes people will have a higher shoulder or a higher pelvic bone. So it's like a pelvic tilt, actually. So you'll have a little tilt in the pelvis. You could have that asymmetry throughout your body. And sometimes we're looking at it through just a narrow lens where we're looking at their posture and thinking of it only in terms of the fascia, or thinking in only terms of the tongue and glossopostural syndrome, right? So when we're talking about all of those things, we're talking about the soft tissue and the impact that that has. So that's not to say that myofunctional therapy can't be beneficial. It's absolutely beneficial for all of those soft tissue dysfunctions that are contributing to postural problems. However, if there is something underlying, because we don't deal with a lot of the hard structures, so those cranial bones, we really don't deal with the bones themselves. If there's underlying issues with the cranial bones, that may manifest itself into other things that we see commonly and may look at from a more narrow lens of, okay, we're watching, and we see our patient has asymmetry, a midline defect, the jaw, they have a crossbite. Perhaps we're looking at a certain open bite that's only on one side, unilateral open bite, posterior open bite. We might look at them and say, hey, the eyes are just a little malaligned. The cheeks are potentially not aligned. We're finding that they're having unilateral TMJ issues, unilateral temporal pain, unilateral something or the other, right? And so we're looking at it through our lens of how we see function. But I would like to challenge you to look at it a little bit deeper. So dive in just a little bit more. And once we start, we're going to take a celebrity and we're going to look at him because he's like everybody's go-to when we talk about asymmetries with face. Bradley Cooper, we'll talk about him in just a little bit. But when you're looking at your patients, you can get kind of a glimpse into the sphenoid. And there's a way that the sphenoid communicates with our friends, our manual therapists, that I think is incredibly important, that we need to start having these conversations, because some of your patients may not be able to hold. And that's what we want. We want autonomy for all of our patients. We want them to be able to hold and sustain all of the results that they achieve from our soft tissue work, all of our neuromuscular re-education. We want all of that to hold. But when there is structural deficits that are not being addressed, that's when we're going to come into a problem. That's where you check in with your patient and you're like, I thought we fixed all this asymmetry. What is happening? Like, why is it looking the same as it was? Why are you relapsing and going back into some of these older patterns? So let's touch in. I should have, I guess, changed the slide a little while ago, but here we are with the sphenoid bone again, and this is how it interconnects with all of these bones. And you'll find that with a lot of your manual therapists. So your manual therapist, you might get a sphenoid adjustment from a chiropractor, your cranial sacral therapist, or your cranial osteopath. They're most likely going to do more of a sphenoid release. So that release will happen in active function. So they will have, and it's amazing for you to talk to your providers that you do work with on an interdisciplinary team about this, because oftentimes they will have the patient suction the tongue up in like that cave hold, so achieving full lingual palatal seal, to apply an inferior pressure on the sphenoid bone, because the sphenoid bone is right behind that maxilla. So we're applying that pressure up there, and then they're going to apply a pressure probably from the top. Sometimes they go from the back, from the occiput, but apply a pressure from the top, where they're going to be on the frontal bones, maybe the parietal bones. Every now and then, you know, there are different providers that learn different methods and different ways. And so you'll find that they'll adjust themselves accordingly. But while the patient is in active function, they're then going to be able to feel the interstitial fluids and do a release. Now, that doesn't happen as quickly as I, just stated it. So this is where interdisciplinary play happens, and is where it's the most beautiful for us to work in that kind of playground, because they need to be able to hold and sustain that suction. Oftentimes they're getting that suction and they're continuing the suction. So they're kind of pumping it, almost like if they're releasing the back of that cave and bringing it back up. So they're pumping or using that peristaltic motion to apply that constant pressure until we get to the right moment that we can release and feel those interstitial fluids, and they get that release of that bone. Now, why does all of this matter? Why do you care about where all these bones are? Why do you care about the sphenoid bone? You care about all this because, one, we want to be able to talk to our providers confidently and with accuracy and know and understand why we're referring people. We want to be able to talk about how it works, how everything works together. So if you look at this cranium and you imagine all of the structures that actually would be within it, so it's always great to look at a skull and to see all the bones together, but you really don't get the full picture of everything until you see all the muscles, you see the brain in there, you see all of our actual attachments that do go along the outside of it that accompany this. So there's a lot of muscular play in here too. So while they are working on the cranial hard structures that we don't work on as functional providers, just working on a lot of our wonderful space where we're working in muscle function and eliminating dysfunction and compensatory patterns, they're able to work on eliminating any sort of the strains and kind of leveling out that sphenoid, because the sphenoid can wind up on a little bit of a tilt, and even a millimeter of a tilt, and oftentimes it's micromillimeters, but even a millimeter of a tilt in that sphenoid is going to display in your patient probably throughout their whole body. So you'll see the difference in the eye level and the eye height. You're going to see the difference in their shoulders. You'll see the difference in their hips, their pelvic floor. They'll have issues with their pelvic floor. Sometimes they even have issues reproductively, that once that sphenoid is adjusted, that reproductive issues tend to, I'm not going to say totally resolve, but tend to be helped throughout their journey into conception and so forth. Mostly for females, because the pituitary gland is a big part of that, and the hormones that are required in order for fertilization of eggs and to have consistent reproductive cycles. But this is an incredible focus piece for all of us to really hone in on and understand. Okay, so let's talk about the pituitary gland for just a second. The pituitary gland sits in one of the fossas of the of the sphenoid. So it doesn't sit in the sphenoidal fossa, it sits in the one just above it. So it's really just right behind where our orbital holes are. So you can look kind of here and you'll see if this was a skull, the orbital holes would be here. And then we have our sphenoid. There we go. And so it's holding it right in a position right there. It's right there. Okay. So this pituitary gland we know is incredibly important. In fact, they call it the master gland. So I know a lot of us, when we talk about hormones and so forth, a lot of focus tends to be on the thyroid. What's going on with our thyroid? Is our thyroid working? Or what's going on with the parathyroid? Is there adequate parathyroid function? But not enough focus and talk on the pituitary gland, as it's the master gland for a lot of the hormone production that happens for a lot of critical tasks that we do daily. So you'll find that some of your patients might even go get their manual adjustment and get their sphenoid adjusted. They go through a little bit of myofunctional therapy, and it's like a night and day switch where all of a sudden now they're sleeping better. They're able to circulate through their circadian rhythm a lot better. They can manage their sleep better. They're able to metabolize better. People who are losing weight faster because they're able to more now balance a lot of the hormones that are associated with the metabolism. Hunger and thirst cues, a lot of those are turned off when we talk about those semaglutides. So we're talking about Ozempic and those types of things. We're talking about these hormonal cues. And so the pituitary gland is incredibly important because it's secreting a lot of that, but it sits within the sphenoid. And we could have a different pressure put against the pituitary gland that's going to impact its ability to function adequately if we have that tilt in the sphenoid. So what's going to happen there is that tilt in the sphenoid is going to represent itself externally, because we can't see the sphenoid bone, right? And in certain aspects, you can't really feel it totally well because it's really embedded in there. But what we do see is kind of indicative of what's happening internally. So with the pituitary gland, when we're looking and we're seeing that there's that dysfunction, if it's shifted more often to the left, I want to say I'm almost 90% certain that that's the way it's supposed to be from my wonderful specialist that I talked to about this. But if it's shifted more to the left, you're going to see more problems with that pituitary gland, more so than if it's shifted to the right. Okay. So either way, you're going to see problems with the pituitary gland, but it may exemplify itself more if you're seeing that sphenoid tilt and it's to the left. So with our pituitary gland being off in any way, shape, or form, and it's not a nice level sphenoid position, you're going to see problems in your patients that will affect all of these wonderful things listed and then some. Okay. So when you're listing and you're getting all of your background information for your patients, because nobody takes a medical history or background quite like an oral myofunctional therapist. And I have a whole nother soapbox I could stand on about how we get all this information from patients and then we do nothing with it. But that's neither here nor there. When you're looking at all of that information, when you're looking at their sleep and all of the issues that they're telling you they may be having with sleep, if you're talking to parents and they're having issues with growth, people who are happening to be going through reproductive cycles and can't really figure it out, women who might not be going through their monthly cycles adequately, people who have difficulties regulating their body's temperature and they aren't iron deficient, metabolism and so forth. When you're looking at all of these things and you're asking these questions and you're getting these responses, it might be time to start putting together one and one once you start really looking at them and seeing how they present. Okay. So the other impact of having a sphenoid tilt is associated pelvic tilt. More often than not, that pelvic tilt. So I like when this image, I like because you're seeing the tilt as a tilt that is, asymmetric as far as the left side being higher than the right. Whereas how it typically manifests is like an anterior versus a posterior tilt. Either way that it's tilted, especially when one side is higher than the other, you'll notice it more in the shoulders and the eyes, and then you can kind of see it in the hips if you're a very good judge of gait and how patients are walking. But that pelvic tilt is going to be indicative of almost how that sphenoid is tilted. So they mimic each other in that way. So when you're looking at their pelvis and how their pelvis is tilted, when you're associating that with their eyes and their eye level and position, you're going to be able to kind of see what's going on with the sphenoid and how the sphenoid might be impacted. That way you could write better notes for your patients, and that way you can really put into words what's happening, and that tilt is often associated. So where the sphenoid is tilted, the pelvis sometimes is tilted, and then that's going to create a change in their gait or their walk. This also can be indicative of various other things too, muscular strains and pulls throughout the fascia, the deep line fascia, when we have difficulties with our patients and them being able to sustain their tongue in proper oral rest posture. And so their tongue is not fully engaging. So a lot of times we find that when we have the patients who have those vaulted palates, that they're not able to fully engage. Their suction might engage in the anterior and maybe some of the posterior of the palate, but it cannot close in that gap because the vault is too high, that they're not fully engaging in the top part of that deep line fascia with their tongue against the palate. And the palate is that first arch of the body that's going to ripple down towards our diaphragm, which is the next arch in the body. And that is then going to create an impact for those feet, which have our last arch of the body. And so those three arches need to be in connection, and they need to be connected and connected well. But we find often that when we have the sphenoid tilt, that creates problems intraorally, and the bite is typically off. More often than not, I find that a lot of those people have their high arch palates, and then those palates, because right behind the maxillary bone is, or right on top of the maxillary bone, I should say, is the sphenoid. And that's going to be a big impactor and a big indicator. That should be red flag number one for you, that something's going on. So as you're looking at their posture and you're kind of putting two and two together, you're like, their tongue's not at proper rest. There's asymmetric, and it's very obvious and apparent. And it looks like their gait is a bit off. They have a pelvic tilt as well. Ring, ding, ding, it might be time for us to do something about this and to work with this patient, okay, on this in an interdisciplinary manner. So let's take our friend here, Mr. Bradley Cooper, and I'm going to take myself Sorry, I keep forgetting how I'm supposed to take myself off the screen. There you go. I did it the right way this time. Okay. I'm going to take myself off the screen so that you could see Bradley all the way. And I did a little cheat line for you. You could kind of see the difference in these two pictures between his eyes and his eye level and height. Is there any other asymmetry that you guys are noticing as you are looking at his face? And I really want this to be interactive, so just throw something in the chat. There are no wrong answers. He's got a lot of asymmetry, but let me know where you're seeing other asymmetries, pulls, or strains. And then from there, we're going to go look at his whole body. We'll look at his teeth. We're going to look and see the ears and the ear height. That winds up being a thing too in different photos. In various photos, you can really, really see it. But outside of the eyes, is anybody else seeing anything else as far as asymmetry? Just throw it in the chat. The eyes are giving me a big indication that there's more than a millimeter, maybe 2 millimeters. If 2 millimeters is probably a lot, might be a millimeter off. Neck is strained on the left side. Yes, neck strain on the left side. I wonder why. I think as we start to look at patients and we're looking more and more, when we start to put things together, I would probably, if I had to guess, assume that he's chewing more unilaterally on that side. Smaller lower ear, sternocleidomastoid bulge. Yes, I think that's that strain that Stephanie had mentioned. Great job. Thank you, Janelle. As we're looking at Bradley, it's just super obvious that there's very clearly a lot going on with this man. And somehow he is a heartthrob. Not that he's unattractive, he's a very attractive man, but as I like to say sometimes, and family thinks I'm weird, I'm like, yeah, I get that they're like, societally attractive, but they're not oral myofunctionally attractive. So that's my whole thing. All right, let's move on to look more at his body. Let's look at his teeth. This little smile photo that I got here. So one, you can see there's asymmetry just all throughout the face, the nose, definitely. But going down his midline, the midline of the teeth, I expected there to be more of a midline shift. There's a very slight one, very, very slight one, less than a millimeter, but it's a very, very slight. And anybody notice that nice little open gap there? He's got a little bit of attrition that's keeping those teeth apart. So it's not like a true open bite, but it is an open bite, right? Those teeth are very worn there. Possible torticollis. Ooh, unresolved torticollis, right? Because a lot of that strain and those cranial patterns in infancy have not been released in a lot of people. Left shoulder is higher. Yes, you're seeing that left shoulder is higher. You can probably look, if we were to be able to see him, and I really tried hard to find a picture, one of the back of his head so that we could really see the ears and the difference between the ears, because it's easier to tell from the back of the head. So if you haven't been looking at some of your patients from the back, you need to start doing that, because it's incredibly telling for a lot of different things, especially those who talk to you about having headaches or pain in the occiput. If you look at them from the back, you'll see more asymmetry sometimes from the back. A lot in men. Sometimes the men with hair, it's very difficult to tell, but if nothing else, you get the ears a lot better than you get looking at them in their full face. But yes, left shoulder is higher is what I was supposed to say. If we were looking at him without all of these clothes, let's say he only had on basketball shorts and no shirt, I'm sure we would be able to tell that there would be an associated pelvic tilt there that is also unresolved. So as far as I'm concerned, I would speculate that Bradley Cooper probably has a sphenoid that is not fully straight and symmetrical. His sphenoid probably has a tilt that looks a lot more like it's higher on that left side, with a little bit of maybe a millimeter. 2 millimeters sounds like a lot, but a millimeter more of that. And so he's got that tilt that kind of follows the whole body through. And I should look for a video of him walking. I'm sure we could probably see it in his gait as well. Okay. So when we're looking at this, we're all like, what are we supposed to do? Like, how can we fix this? Sometimes we look at patients who have postural issues and we think to ourselves, we can do this all on our own, right? There are some people who have taken additional training with Postural Restoration Institute, which is an awesome place. And they talk a lot about, tongue posture and how everything comes together. But as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, myofunctional therapy is very limited in what we can do for the sphenoid itself in its position. That does not mean that myofunctional therapy is not helpful for all people with postural issues. We absolutely are helpful for people with postural issues. It's a matter of us being able to resolve as opposed to just kind of put a Band-Aid on it. We don't want to give a palliative option where we're dealing with all of the soft tissue strains and we're working all that out, but we're never really addressing that sphenoid in its position, because then everything will wind up back. If we only did myofunctional therapy with Bradley Cooper, if we only did orthodontic treatment with Bradley Cooper, we probably wouldn't get the results that you want as far as his asymmetries throughout his body for sure, but definitely in the face, because that sphenoid tilt would just be too much. So we need help, because we can fix this kinda, just not alone. It's not something that I would ever tried to get to on my own as a myofunctional therapist. So 100% it's interdisciplinary care. I think that it's incredibly important that you work with a manual therapist who is experienced in sphenoid adjustments. So either sphenoid adjustments or, being able to do frontal bone adjustment. They're working with the cranial bones, essentially. They're going to get in with those interstitial fluids and really feel around. They're going to have that patient working in function. If you can get on the table with your interdisciplinary provider who does your manual therapy, so that's a craniosacral therapist, a chiropractor, a massage therapist, a physical therapist, or that's probably most likely and my most highly preferred, a cranial osteopath, so a traditional manual manipulative osteopath, DO. So those doctors are going to feel those interstitial fluids, get on their table, really know what's going on with your own sphenoid if you have asymmetries, and be able to have those conversations with patients, because the oral myofunctional therapy is going to help them absolutely to a certain extent. It's not going to be their end all be all, and most likely a lot of what we start doing there won't stick. So you'll find in the long run you have patients that you are just pulling your hair out with. You're trying to figure out why they can't achieve great suction, why the palate is not, doing what you want it to do, as far as you're trying to aim for expansion with whatever it might be, a biomimetic appliance like an ALF, and you're just not getting the movement you want. It's time to bring in a manual therapist, or it's time to bring in a different structural treatment, because more often than not, you're going to need to work that out. Here's a fun fact. Actually, the sphenoid bone early on in the very early editions of Grey's Anatomy actually used to be the top of the spine. So the sphenoid bone was like at the top of spinal alignment. And so a lot of chiropractors actually do work on the sphenoid and do some sphenoid adjustments and or sphenoid manipulation. And so I think it's incredibly important that you have a manual therapist on your team. I don't know, I guess I didn't stress that enough because I feel like I just keep repeating myself about that. Structural treatment is incredibly important too, because the jaw and the jaw's position and any asymmetries that exist within the occlusion, you have people who are only occluding on one side of their mouth and then it's open on the other side. Like, that has to be addressed. It can't just be an oral myofunctional therapy thing. It has to be all inclusive, because the oral myofunctional therapy won't stick for those patients. They will struggle with being able to sustain a lot of the movements and be able to achieve all that you want them to achieve in habituation. So this is my last slide. I am very, very open and welcome to answering all the questions that you might have. I think this is such an incredibly interesting topic. I love talking about the sphenoid bone. I talk about it, I think, at least twice a day, every day with patients. And when I talk to other providers, I like to mention that and throw that in. I will always ask, if somebody asks me, what do I think about their patient and what's going on? Have you looked into their sphenoid bone? And more often than not, people are saying no. And that's actually what spurred this particular conversation, because it's like, well, nobody's talking about this. I don't even see it in any of the Facebook groups or any of the chats where people are like, oh, the sphenoid bone, when somebody mentions that they have an issue. So I thought it was important for us to actually get that on the table. This is something that we need to start looking at, have a more critical eye for a lot of your patients. Start looking at them when you see them and they come in and the eyes are at different positions. That is your number one telltale sign that it is time for you to start considering what's going on with the sphenoid bone and get them on the table of a manual provider. I think one of the questions that I'm probably going to be asked, you're very welcome, Janelle. One of the questions that I'm probably going to be asked is, what do you do with these patients who are limited financially and they need to know what they need to do first? So they can only do, so you give them a treatment plan, you tell them they need a structural provider because they have to deal with the jaw. They need a manual therapist because they have to deal with the sphenoid and the sphenoid's position. And they need myofunctional therapy. And they're like, I can only afford one, or I can only afford one at a time. What do I do? Yes, it's case by case. More often than not, though, I'm going to tell them I want them to see the manual therapist first. Now, what's going to happen is they will see the manual therapist, they will get some work done, and they will start to feel the difference in the movements. And that's going to help to provide them just that little bit of extra that they need to be able to now sustain and start the myofunctional therapy and get in with the structural provider while they're, looking to do their myofunctional therapy. If they have to put it in order, then it's going to be, manual therapy, myo, structural, in that order is more often than not what I would put it. But it's always case by case. So I don't see any questions, unless I'm missing some, but I don't see any questions. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. If you do come up with some questions, I'm happy to be here and to talk to you about all of these wonderful topics. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. I hope everybody has a fantastic evening, and we'll chat again soon. Bye, guys.